Greetings and welcome to another edition of Alusine Multicultural Family Counseling. Our topic for today is perception. Perception is a very important topic to discuss because, like the self-concept, the way we perceive affects the way we communicate. So my approach today is to define perception. After I define perception, I'm going to talk about why perception is important, the barriers to perception, and I'll suggest ways to improve perception. So what is perception? Perception is the selection, understanding of information. We select, we attend, we understand, we remember information. So the first stage in perception is selection, when we focus on a particular stimuli. After selection comes organization. We organize information based on our cognitive. Sometimes we group things together. Sometimes we organize schemata. Sometimes we organize information. We remember what happens first, colors, shapes, all of those are ways we organize information. So we select, we organize, and then we assign meaning. Meaning is the way we assign attributes based on how we perceive. So perception is selection, organization, and interpretation of meaning. Perception is important to study because it is through perception we come to know ourselves. It is through perception we come to know others. It is through perception that we give meaning to the world that we live in. So perception is very important to study. Sometimes the intended message is not the perceived message, and that affects the perceptual process when that happens. There are many reasons why the intended message may not be the perceived message. One is selective perception. Sometimes we select what we perceive. We pay attention to only what we want to pay attention to. Another is stereotyping, when we form attributes to people based on categories. Sometimes that affects perception. Another is ethnocentrism and cultural antipathies, the in-group, the out-group. So all those barriers affect perception. One point that's important to make is that perception of reality is not the same for everybody. We all select. We all organize. We all interpret meaning differently. To illustrate this point, I'm going to tell you a story that was written by Geoffrey Sachs. It's called The Six Blind Men of Hindustan, which illustrates perceptual processes. 6 blind men went to the zoo. They were observing this creature. And from each of their perceptions, they form their own interpretation. One touched the shoulder of the creature and said, "Oh, this is like a wall." One touched the leg and said, "Oh, this is a tree." One touched the tail and said, "Oh, this is a rope." One touched the ear and said, "Oh, this is a fan." So each of them had their interpretation of the same stimuli. And the creature they were observing was an elephant. Were all the blind men right? Yes, from their individual perception, they were right. Were all the blind men wrong? Yes, they were, because they didn't get the big picture of the creature, which was the elephant. So perception of reality sometimes, depends on how we select, how we organize, and how we interpret information. So what are ways that have been suggested to improve perception? Well, one way to improve perception is to recognize that our perceptions are personal, they are subjective, and sometimes they are subject to error. That's one way to improve perception. Another way to improve perception is by perception checking. Sometimes when a situation happens, make a description. Describe what you observe, what you understand. Then from your description, make 2 or 3 possible interpretations. Then check with the person with those 2 or 3 possible interpretations to see which of them is the right perception. That's perception checking. That's one way to improve perception. Another way to improve perception in social settings is to consider 4 variables. The first is, in social settings, what's the characteristic of the perceiver? In social settings, what's the characteristic of the perceived? In social settings, what's the perception of others? In social settings, what's the characteristic of the situation? Sometimes to perceive accurately in social settings, we should consider those 4 variables. Perception is very important. Sometimes miscommunication, sometimes attribution errors occur when the intended message is not the perceived message. So in today's session, I've defined perception. I've talked about why perception is important, the barriers to perception, with the view that each person's perception of reality may be selective. And I described ways to improve perception. As communicators, the best way to understand perception is that sometimes our perceptions are personal, they are subjective, and sometimes they are subject to error. That's why it's good to engage in perception checking. That's why it's good to consider the 4 variables of the perceiver, the perceived, the situation, and the perception of others. These are topics I describe in my textbook, Experience in Interactive Interpersonal Communication. So if this sort of topics interest you, get a copy. It's with Ex Libris. I thank you once more for giving me the opportunity, this time to share my perceptions about perceptions. So, thank you once again. God bless.